Stella Maris was used to being invisible. To the commuters on the subway, she was just another woman in a denim shirt. To the city, she was just a shadow. But tonight, the shadows were hiding something that would change her life forever. She saw at first the tip of a small, gray sleeve. Then, a pair of wide, terrified eyes. A boy, no older than 5, was curled into a ball behind a cold stone planter, trying to become part of the concrete. He wasn't crying. He was past crying. He was in total, paralyzing shock. Stella didn't hesitate. She didn't look for a mother or call out. She knelt in the dirt, opened her arms, and whispered, "I've got you." The boy lunged into her, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. But as she stood up to find help, the park silence didn't just break, it shattered. 4 black SUVs screeched to a halt, tires screaming against the pavement. Doors flew open, and suddenly they were surrounded. Men in sharp, charcoal suits closed in, their hands hovering over their waistbands with surgical precision. One man stepped forward, his face as cold as a winter morning. He didn't look like a father. He looked like an owner. "Put the boy down," he commanded. His voice wasn't a request. It was a death threat. But Stella didn't move. She felt the boy's heart racing against her own. She looked at the army of suits, then back at the man in charge. "No," she said, her voice steady. "He's terrified of you. And I'm not letting go." The police station smelled like burnt coffee and old floor wax, a stark contrast to the sharp, expensive scent of the men who had just hauled Stella and the boy inside. Stella sat on a hard wooden bench in the back of the precinct, her arms still locked around Daniel. The boy hadn't made a single sound since the park. He just buried his face in her denim shirt, his tiny fingers twisted so tightly into the fabric that her shoulders started to ache. Officers drifted past them, casting nervous glances at the group of suits standing guard by the door. Nobody asked Stella for her ID. Nobody asked her if she was okay. It was like she was a part of the furniture, invisible once again, except for the trembling child anchored to her chest. Then, the heavy double doors at the entrance swung open. The air in the room didn't just cool down, it turned to ice. Every typewriter stopped clicking. Every muffled conversation died mid-sentence. Stella looked up and saw a man walking toward them with the kind of stride that suggested he owned the ground he walked on. He was tall, wearing a suit that cost more than Stella made in a year, and his face was a mask of terrifying, beautiful stone. This was Julian Nelson. He didn't look at the police chief who hurried over to greet him. He didn't look at the cameras or the flickering fluorescent lights. His eyes were fixed entirely on the small boy in Stella's lap. For a split second, Stella saw a crack in that stone mask, a flash of raw, jagged pain, but it was gone before she could be sure. Julian stopped 3 feet away. The men in suits stepped back, forming a wall of muscle behind him. "Daniel," Julian said. His voice was low, like the rumble of distant thunder. "Come here." It wasn't a mean voice, but it was a voice used to being obeyed. Stella felt the boy stiffen. She expected him to jump up and run to his father. Instead, Daniel's grip on her shirt tightened so hard she felt a button pop. He let out a small, jagged sob and pulled himself deeper into Stella's arms, hiding his face from the man in the expensive suit. The silence that followed was deafening. Julian's gaze shifted from his son to Stella. Up close, his eyes were a dark, stormy gray. He looked at her natural afro, her tired eyes, and her protective stance. He looked at her like he was trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't invited into his life. "He won't let go," Stella whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. I think he's afraid to." Julian leaned in just an inch, his shadow falling over both of them. "He hasn't touched anyone in months," he murmured, almost to himself. He looked at Stella's hands, then back at her face. "Who are you?" Before Stella could answer, a detective hurried over with a folder, but Julian held up a single hand to silence him. He never took his eyes off Stella. He saw the way she didn't flinch, the way she hummed a tiny, wordless tune to calm the boy. "I'm Stella," she said clearly. "And right now, I'm the only thing keeping him from falling apart." Julian stared at her for a long, heavy moment. Then, he did something no one in the room expected. He sat down on the grimy wooden bench next to her. "Then it seems, Stella," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate whisper, "that you aren't going anywhere." The next morning, the sun barely had a chance to hit the glass skyscrapers before Stella found herself sitting across from Julian in a private room that felt more like a vault than an office. He had traded his charcoal suit for a crisp white shirt, but he still looked like a man who hadn't slept in a decade. On the mahogany table between them sat a thick stack of papers and a single glass of water that Stella was too nervous to touch. "My son doesn't talk, Stella," Julian started, his voice cutting through the quiet. He didn't look at her. He looked at a grainy security photo of Daniel holding her hand in the precinct. "He hasn't said a word since the night his mother's car went off the bridge. Doctors call it selective mutism. I call it a prison." Stella felt a lump form in her throat. She thought about the way Daniel had clung to her denim shirt like it was a life raft. "He's just scared, Mr. Nelson. The world is a very loud place for someone that small." Julian finally looked up, his gray eyes pinning her to the chair. "He's scared of everyone. Except you. Last night, for the first time in a year, he ate a full meal because you sat next to him. He slept through the night because you left your sweater in his room." He leaned forward, his shadow stretching across the table. "I don't believe in coincidences. I believe in results. I want you to move into the estate. Full-time." Stella blinked, her heart doing a nervous gallop. "You want me to be a nanny? I've never even worked in a house like yours. I'm a waitress, Julian. I'm nobody." "I have dozens of nannies with degrees from Ivy League schools," Julian countered, his tone turning sharp. "They have resumes. They have references. But they don't have the key. Daniel has locked himself away, and you're the only person he's let inside. I'm offering you a residential position. You'll have your own wing, a salary that will mean you never have to wait another table, and total security." Stella looked at the contract. It wasn't just a job offer, it was a total life change. She thought about her tiny, cramped apartment and the shift work that left her exhausted. Then she thought about Daniel's wide, quiet eyes. "Is it safe?" she whispered. "Those men in the park. They weren't just police." Julian's face went stone cold again. "The estate is the safest place on earth. As long as you are inside those walls, nothing can touch you." He pushed a silver pen toward her. "Help my son find his voice again, Stella. That's all I ask." As Stella picked up the pen, she felt a strange shiver. Julian was promising her safety, but something in the way he wouldn't meet her eyes made her wonder. Was she moving into a sanctuary or a very expensive cage? She signed her name, unaware that the real danger wasn't outside the walls, but the secrets hidden within them. The gates to the Nelson estate didn't just open, they retreated like a giant silver jaw. As the sleek black car glided up the driveway, Stella felt her breath hitch. The house was a masterpiece of cold glass and sharp angles, perched on a hill like it was watching the rest of the world. It was beautiful, but it felt like a museum where you weren't allowed to touch anything. Inside, the silence was even louder. Everywhere Stella looked, there were men in charcoal suits standing perfectly still. They didn't blink. They didn't smile. They stood against the white marble walls like pieces of human furniture, earpieces humming with secret whispers. Every corner had a camera lens blinking a tiny, red eye at her. "This is Daniel's wing," Julian said, his voice echoing in the vast hallway. Stella walked into a room that was technically a playroom, but it looked like a high-end store. Every toy was perfectly aligned on the shelves. There were no messy piles of blocks, no half-finished drawings, and no life. Daniel sat on a plush gray rug in the center of the room, looking smaller than ever. He wasn't playing. He was just staring at a silver robot as if he were waiting for permission to touch it. "It's too quiet in here," Stella whispered, her voice sounding brave in the emptiness. Julian paused, his hand on the doorframe. "It is secure." "Secure isn't the same as happy," Stella countered. The next morning, Stella started her quiet revolution. She didn't ask for permission. She went to the kitchen and found a box of old oranges and lemons, using the bright peels to create a sunshine trail across the gray floor. She found a Bluetooth speaker and turned on a low, soulful jazz track that filled the hollow hallways. When Daniel saw the trail of orange peels, his eyes widened. For the first time, he didn't look at the cameras. He looked at the floor. He crawled toward a bright orange scrap, his tiny fingers reaching out. Stella sat on the floor, not as a nanny, but as a friend. She pulled out a box of messy, neon-colored finger paints she'd insisted on bringing. By noon, the architecture of silence was under attack. There were blue handprints on the protective plastic she'd laid down. The smell of citrus and wet paint fought against the scent of expensive floor wax. One of the furniture men at the door actually shifted his weight, his eyes darting toward the sound of Daniel's soft, bubbling giggle as he smeared yellow paint across Stella's denim sleeve. From the doorway, Julian watched them. He didn't come in. He stayed in the shadows, his face unreadable. He saw his son's messy hands and the way Stella laughed when Daniel accidentally painted her nose. It was the most dangerous thing Julian had ever seen, a woman who was teaching his son how to be loud again. But as Julian turned to leave, his phone vibrated. A message flashed on the screen: "The perimeter has been breached." He looked back at the warmth in the room, wondering if he had brought Stella here to save his son, or if he had just given his enemies a brand new target. Julian usually spent his evenings in a room made of mahogany and silence, staring at glowing computer monitors that showed every inch of his world. He was a man who lived by the numbers, security feeds, bank transfers, and risk assessments. But lately, he found himself pulling up the camera in the sunroom more than all the others combined. On the screen, the high-definition lens captured a sight that felt like a glitch in his perfect system. Stella was sitting on the floor, her natural hair dusted with glitter, teaching Daniel how to make a fort out of expensive silk cushions. To Julian, those cushions were imported decor. To Stella, they were the walls of a castle. Every time Daniel threw his head back and let out a small, bubbling giggle, Julian felt a strange phantom pain in his chest. It was a sound he hadn't heard in a year, a sound he thought was gone forever. It was like watching a frozen lake slowly crack under the sun. Julian found himself leaning closer to the screen, his breath hitching. He realized he wasn't just monitoring a residential employee anymore. He was watching a woman bring his son back from the dead. He started finding excuses to walk past the sunroom. He'd hold a file he didn't need to read, his shoes clicking softly on the marble. He'd stop just out of sight, hidden by a shadow or a pillar, just to listen to the way Stella talked to the boy. She didn't use the rehearsed, clinical tone the doctors used. She talked to Daniel like he was the most important person in the world, telling him stories about the stars and the city lights. One evening, he watched as Stella reached out and gently tucked a stray hair behind Daniel's ear. The boy didn't flinch. In fact, he leaned into her touch. Julian felt himself unraveling by 2 degrees, his professional armor stripping away piece by piece. He was the most powerful man in the city, but standing there in the hallway, watching them through a crack in the door, he felt like a ghost in his own house. He saw the way the light caught the deep brown of Stella's skin and the genuine warmth in her eyes. She looked up suddenly, as if she could sense someone was there. Julian stepped back into the darkness, his heart racing faster than it ever had during a board meeting or a street standoff. He was starting to realize that the lock Daniel had on his mind wasn't the only one being broken. But as he retreated to his office, he saw a red light blinking on his private line. The syndicate was moving. He had spent so much time watching the beauty inside his walls that he had almost forgotten about the monsters waiting outside. The rain was drumming a steady, restless beat against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the library. It was late, the kind of hour where the rest of the world felt like it had ceased to exist. Stella was reaching for a heavy book on the highest shelf, a brightly colored atlas she wanted to show Daniel in the morning, when the stool slipped on the polished floor. She didn't fall. Instead, she felt a solid, warm weight catch her by the waist. She gasped, her heart leaping into her throat, as she was pulled back against a chest that felt like hammered granite. "I've got you," a voice murmured. It wasn't the cold, commanding voice of the man who ran the city. It was Julian, and he sounded breathless. Stella turned in his arms, her back pressing against the cool spines of the books. Julian didn't step away. He stayed right there, his hand still resting tentatively on her waist, trapped in the narrow space between the shelves and the storm outside. The clinical rhythm of the house, the silent guards, the humming cameras, the strict schedules, all of it seemed to dissolve. In the dim light of the reading lamp, Julian's face was stripped of its mask. He looked at Stella's deep brown skin, the soft glow of her eyes, and the way her denim shirt was smudged with a tiny yellow handprint from earlier that day. He looked like a man who had been wandering in a desert and had finally found a drop of water. "You're shaking," he whispered, his thumb grazing the fabric of her shirt. "It's just the adrenaline," Stella lied, though her voice was barely a breath. The truth was, she felt a pull toward him that was more dangerous than any syndicate rival. She saw the loneliness he tried so hard to hide, the weight of a crown he never asked to wear. Julian's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. He began to lean in, his shadow merging with hers against the glass. For a second, the air between them hummed with 1,000 unspoken words. Stella found herself tilting her head up, her pulse thrumming in her ears. The professional wall they had built was crumbling, brick by brick. But just as the space between them vanished, a sharp, metallic click echoed through the room. It was the sound of Julian's encrypted radio. "Sir," a voice crackled, cold and urgent. "The secondary perimeter has been tripped. We have a visual on a black sedan. It's them." The spell shattered. Julian's hand snapped back to his sides, his face instantly hardening into the architect of power once again. The warmth left his eyes so fast it made Stella's head spin. He stepped back, the glass threshold between them freezing over instantly. "Go to your room, Stella," he said, his voice now like a blade. "Lock the door. Do not come out until I send a guard." As he strode out of the library, Stella stayed frozen against the books. She realized then that the danger wasn't just coming from the driveway. It was already inside, beating in her own chest. The morning after the storm, a package arrived at the front gates. It was a small, battered wooden box wrapped in brown paper, addressed to Stella in a handwriting she hadn't seen in years. When the head of security handed it to her, Stella's hands shook. Inside, nestled in yellowed cotton, was a silver locket, the very one her grandmother had worn until the day she passed away. Stella had thought it was lost forever when her old apartment was cleared out months ago. She pressed the cool metal to her lips, tears stinging her eyes. She felt like a piece of her old life had finally found her in this cold, glass fortress. She wore it all day, feeling a strange sense of peace, even as Julian remained locked in his office, coordinating with teams of men who looked like they were preparing for a small war. By sunset, the peace shattered. Stella was in the kitchen fixing a snack for Daniel when the heavy oak doors burst open. Julian didn't walk in, he stormed in. His face wasn't the face of the man who had held her in the library. It was the precinct face, the mask of stone she had seen the first night they met. Behind him, 3 security guards stood with their hands on their holsters. "Take it off," Julian commanded. His voice was a flat, dead line. Stella blinked, her hand flying to the silver locket. "What?" "Julian, what's wrong?" "This is from my grandmother, it's—" "I said, take it off," he roared, stepping into her space. He didn't wait for her to move. He reached out, his fingers rough as he yanked the silver chain from her neck. The snap of the metal sounded like a gunshot in the quiet kitchen. He dropped the locket onto the marble counter and smashed it open with the butt of a heavy tactical flashlight. Among the tiny fragments of a black and white photo, something else glinted, a speck of green and copper no bigger than a grain of rice. "A high-frequency transmitter," Julian hissed, his eyes burning with a terrifying, cold rage. "The syndicate didn't find us by luck, Stella. They found us because of you. They sent you a gift, and you brought the Trojan horse right into my son's bedroom." "I didn't know," Stella cried, her voice breaking. "I thought it was a miracle. I thought someone found it and mailed it to me." Julian stepped back, looking at her with total disgust, as if she were a smudge on his perfect marble floors. "I almost believed you," he whispered, and the disappointment in his voice hurt worse than the shouting. "I almost let myself forget that everyone has a price. Was I the mark, Stella? Or was it Daniel?" "Julian, please. Don't use my name," he snapped. He turned to his men, his back a wall of ice. "Lock her in the north wing. No windows. No comms. If she breathes toward a door, stop her." As the guards grabbed her arms, Stella looked at Julian, but he was already gone, replaced by a man who treated trust like a fatal mistake. She was being pulled away, not realizing that the real trap was just beginning to spring. The north wing was a tomb of white marble and silence. Stella sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the red marks on her wrists where the guards had held her. She looked at the door, which had no handle on the inside. Julian's precinct face haunted her, the way he had looked at her like she was a virus he needed to scrub away. She wanted to scream that she was innocent, but in this house, voices didn't matter. Only evidence did. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died. The hum of the air conditioning cut out, leaving a heavy, suffocating heat. Outside in the hallway, the rhythmic footsteps of the guards broke into a frantic run. There was a muffled thud, the hiss of gas, and then a silence so deep it made her ears ring. Stella stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Julian," she whispered, though she knew he wouldn't answer. The heavy door groaned and swung open. But it wasn't Julian. A man in a jagged tactical mask stood there, holding a silenced pistol. He didn't look like Julian's polished security. He looked like a scavenger. He grabbed Stella by the hair, yanking her toward the darkened hallway. "You're the one," the man growled, his breath smelling of stale cigarettes. "The girl who made the Ice King melt." "I don't know what you're talking about," Stella gasped, tripping over the body of a fallen guard. "I'm just the nanny." The man laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Julian Nelson doesn't put his best men on a nanny. He doesn't lock a nanny in his private wing. He loves you, sweetheart. And that makes you the most expensive piece of leverage in this city." They dragged her through the service tunnels, away from the high-tech cameras and the sensors that were now dead. Stella struggled, her boots scuffing the concrete, but she was no match for them. As they reached a waiting van at the perimeter fence, she saw the estate on the hill. The lights were flashing red. The fortress had fallen. "He won't come for me," Stella shouted as they shoved her into the dark interior of the van. "He thinks I betrayed him. He hates me." The man in the mask leaned in, sliding a zip tie around her wrists. "That's the thing about mercy, Stella. It's a weakness. He might hate you, but he can't breathe without you. And that's exactly how we're going to break him." The doors slammed shut, plunging her into total darkness. As the van roared away, Stella realized with a jolt of terror that she was no longer a person to either side. She was just a weapon meant to destroy the only man she had ever truly seen. Would he let her die to save his empire, or would the architect of power finally crumble? Back at the estate, the silence was no longer peaceful, it was screaming. Julian stood in the middle of the ransacked north wing, staring at a single denim button left on the floor. His security chief was rattling off protocols about containment and negotiation phases, but Julian wasn't listening. For the first time in his life, the man who built his empire on cold logic felt a fire in his veins that threatened to burn everything down. "Sir, the risk to your reputation if we engage directly," the chief began. "To hell with the reputation," Julian snapped, his voice vibrating with a raw, jagged edge. "They didn't take an employee. They took Stella." He didn't wait for a plan. He didn't call his lawyers. Julian stripped off his expensive suit jacket, tossed it onto the marble floor, and pulled on a tactical vest. He looked at the bank of monitors, the eyes he had used to watch Stella bring his son back to life. Every second she was gone felt like the oxygen was being sucked out of the room. He realized then that he hadn't been protecting her all these weeks. She had been protecting the last piece of his soul. An hour later, the architect of power, arrived at a derelict shipyard on the edge of the city. He didn't send in a drone or a negotiator. He stepped out of his car into the pouring rain, a weapon in his hand and a look in his eyes that made his own elite guards pull back in fear. Inside the warehouse, Stella was slumped against a rusted pillar, the zip ties cutting into her skin. When the heavy steel doors were blown off their hinges, she expected to see a faceless SWAT team. Instead, she saw Julian. He moved through the shadows with a terrifying, surgical speed, taking down the syndicate guards not with the practiced ease of a soldier, but with the desperate fury of a man who had everything to lose. When he reached her, Julian didn't check for trackers. He didn't ask about security breaches. He dropped to his knees in the grime, his hands trembling as he sliced through her restraints. "I thought you hated me," Stella whispered, her voice cracking as she collapsed into him. Julian pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her hair, heedless of the oil and dirt. "I was a fool, Stella," he murmured, his heartbeat thundering against her ear. "I spent my whole life building walls so nothing could get in. I didn't realize I was just locking myself in the dark." He lifted her up, carrying her out of the wreckage like she was the only precious thing left in the world. As they emerged into the gray dawn, Stella saw the fleet of black SUVs waiting. But this time, the men in suits didn't look like jailers. They looked like witnesses to a miracle. Julian had broken every rule he lived by to bring her back, but as he looked down at her, the real question remained: could they ever go back to the way things were? The drive back to the estate was silent, but it wasn't the heavy, cold silence from before. Julian sat close to Stella in the back of the SUV, his hand resting near hers on the leather seat, though he didn't quite touch her. He looked exhausted, his tactical vest stained with salt and rain, but his eyes never left her face. It was as if he was afraid that if he blinked, she might vanish back into the shadows of the city where he first found her. When they stepped through the front doors, the furniture men stood at attention, but Julian didn't even glance at them. He led Stella straight to Daniel's room. The boy was sitting up in bed, his eyes wide and glassy with unshed tears. When he saw Stella, he didn't just smile. He let out a small, jagged cry and scrambled into her arms. "I'm here, Daniel," Stella whispered, rocking him as the morning light began to bleed through the curtains. "I'm not going anywhere." Julian stood by the window, watching them. The architect of power looked out at his vast, expensive grounds, then back at the woman and the boy on the bed. The coldness that had defined his life for years seemed to have finally melted away. Later, after Daniel had fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep, Stella walked out into the hallway. She had her small bag packed. She assumed that now the danger was over and the bug had been cleared, her contract was finished. Trust had been broken, and in Julian's world, you didn't get second chances. She found him in the library, standing exactly where they had almost shared a kiss. He wasn't looking at his monitors or his bank shifts. He was looking at a small, framed photo of Stella and Daniel painting together. "The car is ready to take you back to your apartment," Julian said, his voice low and raspy. Stella nodded, her heart sinking. "I understand. I'm glad he's safe, Julian." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "I spent my whole life being looked at, Stella. People see the money, the power, or the threat. But no one ever really saw me. Not until you." He walked toward her, stopping just inches away. He didn't look like a boss or a titan of industry. He looked like a man who had finally found his North Star. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing her cheek. "I don't want a nanny, and I don't want an employee," he whispered, his eyes searching hers with a desperate honesty. "Stay. Not for the job. Stay as mine." Stella looked up at him, realizing that for the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. She was the center of someone's universe. The girl in the denim shirt had found a home in the heart of the most dangerous man in the city. "I already am," she said softly. Outside, the sun finally broke over the horizon, turning the glass fortress into a house of gold. The silence was finally gone, replaced by the promise of a story that was only just beginning.